Today we're talking about India's great empires. Two-day break in here, and when we come back we'll have India's spice roads and the East India Companies. The special reason I'm mentioning that is when you're in Mangalore and Cochin, keep your eyes open for any discussion, if the tour guides talk about it or anything you see related to the East India Companies or to the spice trade, because Mangalore and Cochin especially were major sites on the Indian spice road, which were really offshoots of the Silk Road, which connected the Far East, that is China, to all the way to the Mediterranean. We'll talk about that a little bit, but we can't get all the talks in before we see all the sites, but just keep your eyes open for that. Then we'll talk about later British India. In fact, the history I'm giving you today will take us up to the history of India prior to or up to the British occupation of India, the British Raj, and so we'll discuss that today. And I will keep putting this up to give you just kind of an introduction. I want to talk today, I'm going to leave that up while I give you a general preface, about the general history of India, again, pre-British Empire days in India. There are four general phases of history or periods of history in India. They're considered pre-Hindu, the Hindu phase, which also included Buddhism, Jainism, Muslim control of India, and then British India. To give you a little bit more breakdown on this, and I'll probably give you a slide with this in writing as I introduce British India. Pre-history, pre the Indus Valley civilization that I've already done a talk on, India was occupied primarily by forest dwellers. The forest areas of India had a people which are known as the Astrikas. They are the Aboriginal people of India in almost every country. We think of Aborigines as being, of course, in Australia, but every country has Aboriginal peoples, unless it was completely unoccupied until somebody showed up. So the Aboriginal dwellers, the forest dwellers, are prehistoric. We then have the Indus Valley civilization, one of the civilization cradles, as we call it, the four oldest. We've discussed that. Starting around 1800 BC, we have what's called the Vedic period in India. This is when we have an influx of people known as the Aryans. Just like the swastika I told you before is an ancient Asian symbol, has nothing to do with Nazis, they co-opted it. The term Aryan means noble. That also was co-opted by the Nazis. When we talk about the Aryan peoples, they're an Asiatic people, nothing to do with Nazi Germany. So the Aryans came in, intermarried perhaps with the people of the Indus Valley, created a people called the Indo-Aryans, and it's right after this time that we get the more formal formulation of Hinduism, of Jainism, and then later, of course, Buddhism comes along. The first kingdom I'm going to talk about today comes along in the 4th century BC. It is the Mauryan kingdom, the largest kingdom ever in the history of India in terms of the number of people and area. In fact, the reason I'm talking about three kingdoms today, Mauryan, Gupta, and the Mughal, they are the three kingdoms in India's history that are actually larger than the total Indian Republic is today. We could go on from there into other smaller kingdoms, but these three were larger actually than India in terms of population and area, especially today. We then had assorted dynasties after the Mauryans, and that lead us up to the Delhi Sultanate, which was the first Muslim control of India, and they were defeated, these Delhi Sultanates, by the Mughal Empire. In between, we have an empire called the Guptas, and we'll discuss those as well. I'll give you a little more detail about this. After the Mughal Empire, in every case, there are intermediate periods where small rulers, little kingdoms, dynasties grow up, but then after the Mughals and a few intermediate minor kingdoms, we then get the British. So we'll get into the details of that as we go along, but I want to start with someone you probably never imagined that you would start a discussion of Indian history with. Should have put this up. This is a modern map of India. One of the things that I want to show you as I start talking about the Mauryan Empire, of course, this is the Indus Valley, the Indus River Valley. It's now mostly in Pakistan, a little bit in India, a little bit in Afghanistan, but originally all of this was considered India. It's called the Indian subcontinent. This was the great river that the Indus Valley civilization started up on. There's another major river system in India, and that is, of course, the Ganges River, the holy river. It is deified by the Hindus. They consider the Ganges River to be a goddess. Well, that was the site of some of the other major empires within India. And I want you to keep that in mind for a second, because right in here, this area, and it was an ancient kingdom called Magadha. Magadha had the benefit, the Ganges River flows out of the Himalayas, which means that even in dry season, it doesn't dry up because it's glacier fed. It has always, for millennia, been bringing silt, fertile soil down out of the mountains, so that the Ganges River Valley, you can see the green there, is, with the possible exception of some of the southern regions, is the most fertile and well-watered part of the whole Indian subcontinent. The kingdom of Magadha, the small kingdom, became the centerpiece, or the source of some of the major empires that were to come later. After the Indus Valley civilization, and one of the reasons that we believe that it ended was because some of the major tributaries to the Indus River dried up. Well, the Ganges, the fertility in the Ganges led this Magadha region to be the center of some of India's most important empires. But I want to go back to start with somebody you wouldn't have thought of, and that is Alexander the Great. On previous cruises, I've done talks about Alexander the Great. This was the empire of Alexander. He started in Macedonia, took over all of Greece. Actually, his father, Philip of Macedon, did that first. Then all of Asia Minor. Basically, he conquered all of the Persian Empire, all of Egypt. And you'll notice he gets over here into the areas that are now Pakistan and the Punjab region, which is partly Pakistan, partly India. From there, when Alexander had conquered all of these areas, he established satraps, which were governors. Some of the governors that he put in place here in Bactria and the areas that we now know of as the Punjab began to move over and take over areas in here. And you can even read, if you can read that from that far, that's the Mauryan Empire. When Alexander the Great was 32 years old, and was returning back to his home, he got as far as Babylon and he died. What he died from, we're still not sure. There are a lot of different theories about that, even that he might have been poisoned. Well, he had no male heirs. And so at 32, he had conquered most of the known world. He had wanted to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean, to the great waters. And all of his generals, after 10 years of marching and campaigning, they all said, Al, we want to go home. So finally, he kind of had to give in. They all headed back, and when they got as far as Babylon here, which he wanted to make the center of his empire, because it was kind of in the center, he died. Just before his death, all of his generals were gathered around his bed, and they said, Alexander, who is to be heir of your kingdom? And there's some question as to what he said, but the general idea is that he said, to the strongest. Well, to a bunch of military generals, saying to the strongest was just an invitation for war. And so we went through a period of a number of years where we had what's called the War of the Diadochi. Diadochi means successors. At the end, after the dust settled a little bit, you had Ptolemy, one of the major generals, controlling all of Egypt. The Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt continued down to Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. She was the last of the Ptolemy rulers, which means, you can't get more Egyptian than Cleopatra, right? She actually was Macedonian in heritage. The area over here, most of what would have been Persia, the main body of Persia, was conquered by Seleucus, another of the major generals. So this was the kingdom of Seleucus. The area of what we knew as Palestine, or Israel now, and most of Asia Minor was controlled by Antigonus Monophthalmus. Monophthalmus because he only had one eye. So he was one of the generals, and then Cassander controlled a smaller area. Cassander and Lysimachus was a minor general. They controlled part of Asia, the original homelands of Thrace and Greece. Now the reason that's important, can you read that? This says Mauryan Empire. Seleucus began to see his territory taken over by Indian armies. This is the outline of what became the Mauryan Empire. It was one of the largest empires ever after, and to that point in time, after Alexander's. It controlled virtually all of the Asian subcontinent. You'll notice Seleucid Empire up here. They kept pushing up against the area that Seleucus, the general, controlled, Alexander's general. They had begun here in this area. This is what I told you had been one of the richest areas. They had amazing agriculture, a lot of trade. They were economically really advantaged from being there. And from this area, they began to develop an empire, which the real launch of an empire was by a man named Chandragupta Maurya. That's why it's called the Mauryan Empire. Chandragupta Maurya. I'll talk to you about another Chandragupta in just a minute. It's a different guy. But after Alexander had left, and left something of a vacuum, he put satraps, governors in place. They began to try to take over some of the areas up here. And the Mauryan Empire, under Chandragupta, his son and especially his grandson, would have none of that. They pushed back, and they had an enormous army. It's estimated they had 200,000 soldiers. They had as many as 40,000 chariots. They had a cavalry, and they had as many as 6,000 war elephants. The only person that had ever been successful in fighting against a significant number of war elephants was Alexander. He defeated the Indian king Porus, who had war elephants, but he was so impressed that he made Porus one of his governors when he left. Well, they had, from their beginning here, they built up a major empire that covered all of this area. It's the largest empire ever in the India subcontinent. It's estimated they had between 50 and 60 million people. This is 250,000 square miles that they were in control of. Their capital city was Pataliputra, which is right here. You'll notice it's right on the Ganges River system. And they have more cities here than they do out in the periphery. The city that they had was along 8 miles of the Ganges River. It had a 21-mile circumference. Beside the riverside, they had a 900-foot wide moat that apparently they could flood with sewage if they chose to. Yuck. And then an enormous wooden palisade behind that moat. The city had a circumference, a walled circumference of 21 miles of wall. The walls had 570 towers, 64 gates. It's estimated that 500,000 people lived within the walls of that city. At the time, it was probably the largest city in the whole world. And this was the Mauryan Empire. Besides having such an extraordinary city, they created a road system to connect the various cities within their empire. They had mile markers along the road. They had rest stops periodically along the way, and they even went so far as to plant mango trees along the route of their road system, thousands of miles of it, so that people would both have shade as they traveled and also something to snack on as they went along. You know, mangoes. Who doesn't like a good mango in season? So Chandragupta Maurya started all of this. He was the real conqueror. His son came along in Bindusara and didn't add a whole lot. But his grandson, Ashoka, is considered to this day one of the most important persons in Indian history. He is a major figure, even though he is not Hindu. He converted to Buddhism. Hinduism was the dominant religion at that time. When Ashoka took over from his father, who had been in power briefly after his Chandragupta, Ashoka started further expansion. In 261 BC, he conquered the last empire area, which was in the east, called the Kalinga region. During the Kalinga campaign, 100,000 people were killed, 120,000 people were sold off into slavery. Now, Ashoka, like his father and his grandfather, had been very strong military figures, military leaders. They were conquerors. But for some reason, when Ashoka witnessed the 100,000 dead because of his Kalinga campaign, he was struck by that. And he decided to renounce violence. He became a Buddhist. He had been sort of a loose Hindu, but he became a Buddhist. He renounced all violence. He became a vegetarian. He renounced not only all violence against people, but all violence against animals. He began to advocate this and even became a major sender of missionaries throughout the world, even to Western Europe. There were Buddhist missionaries going out from that point. He wrote some things that were called the Edicts of Ashoka, and he would add to them from time to time. And we have many of these, either on stone, large stones, stone tablet kinds of things, or on the columns of major columns in various areas throughout the Mauryan Empire. And they include statements about forgiveness. I mean, he went from being this ruthless military conqueror to really advocating forgiveness. He even went so far in some of his edicts as saying the king himself, if someone offends him, the king chooses to forgive if what has been done can be forgiven. So, completely changed his attitude on all of this stuff. These columns with an inverted lotus flower and lions, this became the symbol for Ashoka. And to this day, if that looks at all familiar to you, that's the national symbol of India. This is the significance that they held Ashoka in. These multiple lions at the top of a column became the symbol for the entire country of India. He is still to this day considered one of their very greatest heroes. But from Chandragupta and his son and his grandson Ashoka, this is a silver coin printed with an elephant, a wheel, various other things. Coinage is one of the things that is used most often to both identify various ancient civilizations, but also to be able to determine their wealth. This is pure silver. And so they were a very, very wealthy people in that time. Because of the spread of Buddhism under Ashoka, he had as many as 84,000, it's believed, stupas. Stupas are shrines for Buddhists. Particularly, they are places that hold either the relics, the remains, part of the remains of Buddha, or of one of the Buddhist teachers that are held in high regard. And Ashoka himself saw to it that thousands of these held just a little piece of the Buddha. They're sort of modeled on burial mounds. But they are major shrines, places for devotees to visit. Now, even though he was himself, he became fairly radical Buddhist, he was still very open to other beliefs. Hinduism was very popular. Jainism was still very popular. In fact, the founder of this whole empire, the Mauryan Empire, Chandragupta Maurya, late in his life, he set himself off the throne, made his son, Bindusara, the king, and he became a Jain. So he renounced all violence as well, in a much more radical way even. He began to travel around with Jain monks, and eventually, in order to achieve enlightenment, in order to renounce all that he felt he had done wrong in his life and everything else, he did something I mentioned earlier in the conversation about Jain. He went into a state of fasting and fasted until death. So this was the guy that founded this empire, and this is the most radical of the things that the Jains do, but they are known for their asceticism. This is a map from this area of India. He sent missionaries, Buddhist missionaries, to spread the news up to the Tarim Basin, which is called the Taklamakan Desert, which is a main route that goes between China, which is over here on the curtains, and the rest of the Western world. Bactria, that's where the camels come from, Bactrian camels. Over into Burma, south to the south end, there was a section down here that wasn't under control of the Mauryan Empire, and also to Sri Lanka, as far as Athens, Antioch, Alexandria. To this day, you will find major monuments. They have found some of the edicts of Ashoka as far as Europe, so that they know that this was really being actively spread. One of the things that the Silk Road and the Spice Road, I'll talk about all of those when we get back from Cochin, one of the things they did, we think of them as being responsible for transporting silks and spices and even horses. The silks and things from China, they were trading them primarily for horses, because the horses in China were not strong enough, they didn't have enough potassium in the grass, they couldn't carry a person. And so they were looking for these powerful horses that the nomads and people in the West had. So anyway, all of this spread of goods is what we think about as being the Silk Road. But even more important than that was the spread of culture. Religion, Nestorian Christianity moved east, Buddhism moved west. A lot of the arts and culture, the paper making, eventually how to make silk, which the Chinese kept secret for a long time. The idea of printing, the Chinese had movable press, even though we think Gutenberg invented that. and lots and lots of other things. But religion, ideas, philosophy, a lot of that moving back and forth. And throughout the major trade routes that you'll get across the Tarim Basin, into this area, Bactria, Afghanistan, down into India, to this day you will find enormous places of worship that were set up. They were either Buddhist, there are some Hindu shrines that were set up, there are some Christian areas, particularly Nestorian Christians, a particular kind of Christians that had been declared heretics from the West, so they moved east. But enormous kinds of representation of the cultural interchange. And Ashoka did more than his share of that in terms of moving the message of Buddhism around the world. Another thing that he did is he had not only committed to nonviolence against humans, but as I say, not against humans, but against animals. He became a vegetarian, and not only that, he set up hospitals to care for people, and he set up hospitals to care for animals. They knew a lot of various medicines, drugs, plants, fruits that were beneficial in various ways to treat diseases, both for humans and for animals. And if those were not available in areas where he was setting up these hospitals, then he would have the plants imported and planted and grown so that there would be medicinal, various kinds of medicinal treatments available both for people and for animals. So the Mauryan Empire is the largest empire ever to exist in the Indian subcontinent. We then go on to the next, after the Mauryan Empire, which was the 3rd and 4th century BC, there's a period of quite a long time. The date we have on this one is 320 to 550. So we've got a period of about 600 or 700 years that it was just small little kingdoms, people calling themselves kings or rajas, or even maharajas, which means the high king, but they didn't control very much property. We get around to the Gupta Empire, which was centered in the same area. It followed the Mauryan Empire in terms of being centered along the Ganges River, which is where they had the greatest opportunity both for trade, for growing crops, for all of those things. Eventually, the Gupta Empire would cover all of this area. It is still Buddhist, Hindu, Jain. We don't have the introduction of Islam yet, because of course Islam didn't come along until 600. The official start of the Islamic faith is 622 during the Hijra, the movement, and I'll talk about that in the last lecture, the immigration from Mecca to Medina by Muhammad and his followers. In addition to all this area that they controlled, they also had allies down here in the south and then had various campaigns down here. So they controlled a significant amount of area as well. This was actually, even though it's not as big a kingdom, this was called the Golden Age of India, because during this time they developed extraordinary arts, music, literature. It was during the period of time of the Gupta Empire that they actually formalized and finalized some of the ancient Vedic writings. The Rig Veda and the Rama Veda and some of the others. This was where they really finalized it, had final copies of them, and started reproducing them and distributing them in the Hindu faith. Again, extraordinary artwork during this time. This actually is a place in Indonesia, but it's built on it looks Indian because this is an example of the expansion of the Indian art themes during the Gupta kingdom, or during the Gupta Empire. And this is a stupa, a shrine. We have these wonderful arts. This is the god Vishnu playing chess with a young woman. We have various Buddha images as well, and just quite extraordinary artistic period. Writing, song, painting, visual arts, sculpture. The Gupta period was very, very important. Unfortunately, the Gupta period only lasted a fairly short time in terms of empires. It finally fell apart through feuds between descendants from Gupta. In this case, does not relate to Chandragupta Maurya, who was the first empire, the Mauryan Empire, and also feuds with some of their neighbors, people that it had allies with. And the third major empire that I want to talk about briefly is the Mughal Empire. Here is where we transfer over into the Islamic state, or the Muslim period, in the history of India. Actually, prior to this, prior to 1526, there had been a series of what were called the Delhi Sultanates. You know, they were centered in Delhi, and they had come in from Persia. They had been converted to Islam when the Arabs invaded Persia. They came over, they established the Sultanate, but they didn't, you know, they were not that significant, and they were conquered in 1526 by one of the descendants of Genghis Khan and of Timurid, the Tamerlane, the Timurid dynasty. The Mongols in 1200s had conquered, you know, they had the second largest empire in history, the largest contiguous empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean all the way to Western Europe. And they eventually, after Genghis Khan's death, it broke up between four of his sons and grandsons, and one of them was the Chagatai Khan. One of his sons was named Chagatai, and it was the area up in here, okay, basically. And the descendants, Timurid, Tamerlane, he created a dynasty as well. He was not a direct descendant, but he was a married relative. Those families had intermarried, and they created a Turco-Mongol group they were descendants of the Chagatai Khan. They invaded Persia, and then initially they created an empire in Afghanistan. This is the Hindu Kush Mountains, Kabul, Afghanistan, over to Lahore in modern-day Pakistan. So they began there, and eventually, in 1605, one of their kings, Akbar the Great, conquered most of India, and then by 1707, other descendants had conquered virtually all, except the very southern tip of India, into the Mughal Empire. This is the second largest empire, whereas the Mauryan Empire of the subcontinent of India, the Mauryan Empire had 5 million square miles. These guys had 4 million square miles. Still a lot. They controlled a great deal of the territory. They were very much Indo-Persian. You know, they brought a Persian sensibility to a lot of things. This is considered, whereas the Gupta Empire is considered the golden age in terms of art, this is considered the last golden age. Because these three empires, Mauryan, Gupta, and Mughal, all of them really, because they were wealthy, they had a significant input into the artistry, into the wealth of India, and so we have a significant impact through this Mughal Empire. Some of the images, this is the original founder of the Mughal Empire. His name was Babur. Babur is the one who defeated the Delhi Sultans in 1526 to create the early Mughal Empire. And then all of the big chunk of it was conquered is by Akbar the Great, who's represented right here. And then later on, the fifth emperor became very famous. His name is the Shah Jahan. He ruled from 1628 to 1658 for 30 years. He was known for building major projects, major mosques, palaces. The thing he is most known for, you recognize that? This is the Taj Mahal. He built it for his favorite wife, whose name was Mumtaz Mahal, and it was built between 1632 and 1653. It took about 20 years to complete it. The last 10 years they were sort of polishing, I think. But during the time of the Mughal Empire, they controlled 1/4 of the world's population within this empire, and so it was a very significant time. The great deal of economic progress, successful conquest, under all of these emperors, but again, they began to have some competition, and they ended up being conquered by the subsequent controllers of this region, which are called the Marathas. The Marathas and the Mughals were struggling back and forth. They did so for about 200 years, and then eventually the British got involved. And it was because at first the British East India Company comes in to begin to take advantage of the spice trade and things of that sort. And then they were supporting the last emperor of the Mughal Empire. His name was Bahadur Shah II. And in 1857, the Bahadur Shah II encouraged an Indian uprising, the 1857 uprising, which I'll talk about when I talk about British India, which was a very bloody affair, and the British decided that the Shah who had encouraged this, the Sultan, was himself guilty of being a traitor, because they had agreements about these sorts of things. So they arrest him, they imprison him, eventually they exile him, and at that point the British government takes over, and they take over control of all of India under the East India companies. Later on, we have Queen Victoria is given a crown and told that she is now the Empress of India. And at that point, it becomes known as the British Raj. India is the British Raj, meaning that they now have a king, a ruler. It's actually a queen, it was Queen Victoria. But these three periods, very important in the history, and if you study Indian history and go back, the main characters in these are some of the most important heroes in developing the history of India overall. And we'll sort of pick that line up, and I'll reiterate some of this stuff when we talk about British India. But from the Indus civilization to the Hindu period, the Vedic period, from there with the Indo-Aryans coming in, and then after that the Mauryan Empire. In between there's always these little kingdoms, the Gupta Empire, then little kingdoms, and then we get to the Islamic period, and then the British. The history is pretty straightforward in that regard. Any questions about any of that? And there they sat stunned for some moments. Yes?
Is there a relationship between the word Mongol and Mughal?
Yes. Is there a connection between the words Mongol and Mughal? Yes, there is. Because these were descendants of the original Mongols, descendants of Genghis Khan, of his son Chagatai, and of their relative Tamerlane, the Timurid. He created a separate dynasty that was an offshoot of that. But Mongol is the same root as the Indian word Mughal. So you can identify that. Other questions? Yes?
I'm curious about your maps. The south of India seemed never, the very south, Kerala,
Right.
was never part of the conquered empires. Is there a reason for that?
Is there a reason why the very southern tip of India seems almost never to have been conquered? That's a great question. I think they didn't like the food. Let's go back here. There were times, you're absolutely right. Sri Lanka and the southern tip, in fact, Cochin is a major city in the area that was never conquered. I don't have an answer for that. I'd have to look it up. Maybe, I'm from the south in the United States, and southerners can just be tough. So maybe that's what it was all about. They never conquered them. But I'll find out. When we get back together and talk about British India, I'll have an answer for you, but I don't have an answer right now. So, other questions? This is a short talk today because I want to just prepare you for some of what you're going to see the next couple of days, and then we'll pick it back up when we talk about British India and the history there. Yes?
Just one question. Was there any direct political interconnection between the Islamic State in terms of influence and the Mughal Empire?
Islamic State, you mean in terms of the modern Islamic State?
No.
Okay.
I'm talking about Persia all the way into there.
Well, by the time we get here, was there any direct relationship between Persia and the Arabic states and here? By the time we get here, there was already a lot of division. I mean, by the time we get to the Muslim period, which we're talking about the Mughals here. Okay. By 1525, the Caliphate of the Islamic world had lost its, it had gotten too big, it had really lost a lot of its central control. In fact, there was a period of time prior to this in which there were two claimants to the Caliphate. There was the Fatimid Caliphate, which is centered in Egypt, and then the Abbasid Caliphate, which is centered in Baghdad, were still existent, and they were both claiming authority. And so at that point, the Mongols actually ended the Abbasid Caliphate when they marched through and destroyed the city of Baghdad. That was the end of the Golden Age. So the Mongols had cut a lot of that off. It was later on that a lot of them were converted to Islam, including the descendants of Chagatai. And so when they marched in, they weren't really under anybody's control anymore. And the fact that they saw themselves, any of the people that saw themselves as direct descendants of Genghis Khan, like the Chagatai Khan's descendants and whatnot, they pretty much didn't let anybody tell them what to do. No matter what the religious things were. But by that time, the Islamic Empire was so huge and it had had so many different, you know, it was broken up in pieces that there was not a whole lot of control from anywhere else in terms of in Islam. Yes, Roger first.
Yeah, thank you very much. Perhaps you'll cover it in the later lectures, but you know, can you say a few words about Gandhi's struggle and independence?
Gandhi's struggle and independence, I will do a talk specifically about that.
Okay.
Sort of the order that I'm going to do the future talks in, I want to talk about the spice trade so that you know why everybody wanted to go there. Then I'm going to talk about the East India companies, not just British, but Dutch East India, etc., and the influence that they had. And then I'm going to talk about British India, the British Raj, the jewel in the crown. I mean, India, in fact, so many people felt like they fought for such a long time to retain India as a possession of Britain because they felt like it was so important to them if they lost it, that it would be the end of the empire. And they were right. They believed that when in the late 40s, when India finally declared their independence in 47, that is usually the place where people say the British Empire ended. It doesn't mean they lost all of their properties around the world, but that they were no longer really an empire. So I'll talk about the British Raj, the British Empire, the jewel in the crown, and then I'm going to talk about Gandhi and the struggle for British independence will be a separate talk because there's a lot to that.
Are you going to show us the Ben Kingsley's movie?
I don't think they brought it along, Ben Kingsley's movie. I mean, still, when I think of Mahatma Gandhi, I picture Ben Kingsley, don't you? Right? It's like you got that in your head. It's like when I think of Jim Morrison, I think of Val Kilmer, not the real Jim Morrison. You had a question?
What about the religions in this time? That was the yellow one will be Muslim, the brown one more Hindi. How did they behave and mix and things like that?
Right. All of this was Muslim. All of what they controlled was officially Muslim, but the thing that most Westerners don't get is that with very rare exceptions historically, whenever Muslims took over an area, they did not require others to convert to their religion. They would not have tried to force Hindus. They especially were generous toward, and I talked about that with one of you all this morning. They were especially generous toward Jews and Christians because they consider them people of the book. That there have been corruptions in Judaism and Christianity, but they still are the same source. But even so, even with what they would have considered pagan, like Hinduism, which has multiple gods, which is the absolute strictest rule in Islam, it's called the Tawhid, which means the oneness of God. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, is the declaration, the Shahada. And the worst sin, in fact, the unforgivable sin that you can commit is shirk, which means to take anything and make it equal to Allah. Well, they would not have liked the Hindu religion. And there had been some oppression of other religions. For instance, you will remember, those of us who went on the spiritual legacy, we saw the fire temple of the Zoroastrians. Well, the reason that they're in India instead of still being in Persia or Iran is that they were driven out because of persecution. So the Muslims were not completely free of persecution, but they actually generally would require an extra tax if you were not Muslim. There may be some other restrictions on you, but for the most part, they would leave people alone. They would allow them to practice their own religion. So all of this would have been, even though it had been Hindu before, it became Muslim.
Yes. How was the relationship in between Muslims and Hindus? Later on in the 1940s, they were like that.
Yeah, there have been conflicts obviously between Hindus and Muslims. What happened, and I'm going to flip back to one of my earlier maps. In 1947, at the same time that India gained their independence, there were a significant minority of of Muslims in predominantly Hindu India. At the same time that they were gaining their independence, and this was part of the process that made it very difficult, the majority of Muslims went either west to here, and later became the country of Pakistan, which was declared right about the same time that India was declared, or they went east. This used to be called West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and then later East Pakistan declared their independence as a separate nation called Bangladesh. The predominantly Hindu areas are the mainland of India, but you'll notice there's a narrow connection here, and then this colorful part here is also part of the nation of India, the Republic of India. And so At the time this happened, there were 12 million refugees. There's estimated 2 million people died in the conflict between, most of them just disappeared, in the conflict between the Muslims who were seeking their own nation and the main body of, which became the Republic of India, which is predominantly Hindu. There are still Muslims living here and getting along fine. I mean, they have various difficulties from time to time, but then, you know, I've seen fistfights between Methodists and Baptists too. So, you know, you run into some of those problems, but for the most part, the division, after the refugee problem was resolved and everything else, now Pakistan and India still really don't like each other. They are both nuclear powers. That's one of the scary things. Those of you who were on Sandy's bus, the guide, she was talking about even in cricket. She said, we don't care who else the Indian cricket team loses to. They can lose to Canada, they can lose to Kenya, but they cannot lose to Pakistan. You know, so, and there's constantly that struggle. The Taj Mahal, where some of us had lunch the other day, there was a terrorist attack there a number of years ago, and it was a radical Muslim group that was from Pakistan. India accused the government of Pakistan of being involved in supporting that, and there were huge international problems. Again, we're talking about two nuclear powers. They both have nuclear weapons, so this is always a little scary. So yes, there are conflicts, but there are conflicts all over the world for various kinds of reasons. Okay? Anything else? Yes?
Could you say a few words about the conflict of Kashmir that's been going on for 70 years?
The conflict with Kashmir, there are a number of different areas within this that have wanted to be their own country, that have wanted to declare their own independence. This area up in here is the Punjab. You know, this is Amritsar right there. That's the capital of, that's the Sikh capital. That's where the Golden Temple is. And they've had violence. You know, the Sikhs, during the time of Indira Gandhi, they were feeling like they were being oppressed, and they declared they were, you know, a rebellion. Well, as a result of that, one of the bodyguards of Indira Gandhi, who was a Sikh, assassinated her. She died by an assassin's hand who was a Sikh because of what that was going on there. I only say that because there are a number of different areas, the Punjab being one, Kashmir being one, others, that have consistently declared their desire to be their own because of a religious difference, a cultural difference, whatever. I can't give you more specifics in terms of that particular conflict, but there's always that issue here of various places wanting to, you know, Bangladesh wasn't happy being East Pakistan, so they declared their independence. And we still have those difficulties. Well, thank you all very much for being here. Enjoy your next 2 days on land, and we will come back the following day with 2 more lectures.